Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a pop culture podcast. I'm Alastair Ball.
And I'm Nick Bryan.
And this week we'll be talking about Netflix series Better Call Saul, DC's new lineup of comics, R-rated superhero movies, and British BBC grim detective show Messiah.
Thanks to everyone who listened to the last episode and said nice things, and to everyone who hated it, thank you for not telling us. If you did particularly enjoy the last episode and want about 6 minutes more of it, I've been posting a few outtakes on our official Twitter account, well, on our SoundCloud page linked to the Twitter account, under the amazing brand name Excessive Fantasy Violence, which is genuinely the best thing I came up with all week, I swear to God. Anyway, so yeah, there's a few more minutes of us talking about basically every superhero film for the last couple of years. There's a couple of minutes about other true crime recommendations, and there's a review of LO and Google+, possibly our most topical content. Yep, so those are at MFV podcast on Twitter, or I think we're soundcloud.com/moderate fantasy violence. Okay, with the past out of the way, let's get into this nice big number 2. So funny.
So first up this week, we're going to be talking about Better Call Saul, the second series of which started on Netflix a few weeks ago. 2 episodes have been posted up. It's going up week by week. The first series was well received. Obviously, Breaking Bad was enormously successful. But Better Call Saul is quite different. I mean, a lot of people I've talked to about it have said, oh, Breaking Bad was so good, but you can never do anything like that good again. It's just going to be a poor imitation. But I think with Better Call Saul, they've gone in a different direction, which is what's really made it a success for me.
I think it's very understated in comparison. I mean, most Breaking Bad episodes had some sort of really massive over-the-top sequence, whether it was a gunfight or Walter White diving around in his pants. Yeah. Whereas in Better Call Saul, it's mostly like conversations and character stuff. The biggest action often is that one of these conversations the characters are like massively lying.
It's very much a character study, much more than like a sort of action-based dramatic story like Breaking Bad. I got the feeling that the first 2 episodes, the second episode especially, they did the very classic Breaking Bad, really high tension, like really nail-biting, edge-of-your-seat stuff, just so they could show, you know, this we can still do it. This isn't going to be a dramatic sort of letdown after Breaking Bad. But then after that, they settled into a much more sedate, character-driven format. They went more into like people's backstory. We got a lot of Saul's backstory. We've got a lot of Mike from Breaking Bad. He's the only other character, pretty much, they brought over.
Yeah, there was Chuco Salamanca for like 2 episodes, and I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah, and I think the woman who runs the sort of pedicure place, I think it was in Breaking Bad, but probably for all of 5 seconds. But yeah, they've only really brought over Saul and Mike, and they've gone back into their backstory in quite a lot of detail. It plays around with time. In the first series, you get some different narrative threads, some which Saul, or as he's known at this point, Jim McGill or Jimmy McGill, some in which he's a short order con man or a kind of low-level con man, so getting money out of people. Someone he's sort of, in some plot threads, he's working in a law firm in a sort of mailroom capacity with his very, very successful brother who owns and was a partner in the law firm. In some plot threads, he's a down on his luck criminal lawyer doing public defender stuff for kind of low-level misdemeanors. And then they kind of blend these 3 plots, which all took place in different points in history, into kind of a complete picture of, you know, the person who Saul is.
In the second season, I think it feels like more like they're trying to be a TV show, for lack of a better term. Like, the first season, as you say, was quite loose. The only real common thread was that it had the character in it, sort of bubbling through his life, and it sort of felt like a sort of connected series of vignettes. And in the second season, they've got this sort of, it feels like this status quo that was really like nailed in the second episode. The sort of idea of him working by day in this new law firm with a sort of supporting cast of the principal from Veronica Mars and his sort of excitable assistant, and him doing dodgy jobs on the side, which is clearly going to torpedo his entire life eventually.
Yeah, I mean, with all prequels, there's one tension, which is, like, how do you get to the point we're familiar with? So, you know, kind of with, say, Batman Begins, there's like, how do we get to a point when there's this sort of, you know, the Caped Crusader fighting crime? With the Star Wars prequels trilogy, it was like, how do we get to a point when there's a galactic empire and this guy called Darth Vader running around being evil? And the tension is very much, how do we get to a point when this character Saul is a kind of cynical criminal lawyer who does everything to keep criminals away from justice, bends and breaks the law as much as he can. How does he get to that point from a man who is pretty, I don't know, he's not naive, but he's certainly someone who sees the best in the world and wants to do good, make a good impact, be a normal, respectable lawyer, make his older brother proud, who's a normal, respectable, successful lawyer.
I think there's a sort of a tension that was maybe slightly missing in the first season, but it didn't feel like he had a huge amount to lose, and that his life seemed a bit terrible. And but he's going to become Saul, and yes, it seems like he's lost touch with a lot of his old friends, but most of them seem to view him in a sort of slightly pitying, contemptible way. Whereas in the second season, I think there's maybe a bit of attempting to build in a bit of tragedy there, like a bit of positive reinforcement for Jimmy McGill's life. Like, he has to at some point choose to give up this chance of respectability and this relationship with Kim in order to become Saul. So there's a bit of ambiguity and a bit of tragedy to it, rather than it just being hope he'll become Saul soon, because then he'll get to be happy. Oh, good, he has. Hey! Yeah,
exactly. I can imagine this series would carry us to the point where he is the Saul character we're used to from Breaking Bad, taking from the point when he's the actual transition from respectable lawyer into criminal lawyer.
Yeah, but at the same time, they're moving it forward enough. Like, the bit at the end where he gets the call from Mike to ask if he fancies bending his principles a bit for, as Kim says at the end, really just a bit of a thrill. There's nothing actually in it for him at all.
Yeah.
That's the moment where even though you know he's going to become Saul, and on some level you want him to become Saul, you're sort of going, oh, don't do it, Jimmy. You could actually have a pleasant life. But, of course, he does.
I got the sense to do that to get back at his brother. I think the characters in Better Call Saul are just flawless. It's so well written. They're fully realised. You really get a sense of all the characters, down to even some of the smaller supporting people. It's not even done explicitly, but you get a solid sense of where they come from, who they are, what sort of people they are, how their values intersect. I mean, it's one of those things, it's not heavy on dialogue, it's not heavy on action, it's got quite a lot of slow bits, it's beautifully shot, like Breaking Bad was, by the guy, I believe, who's going to direct the next Star Wars movie, the next, full Star Wars movie.
I know he did a few of the, key Breaking Bad episodes, didn't he?
Yeah, and I believe he's going to direct Star Wars Episode 8, so that should be good.
So,
yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's what the feeling you get from really good TV shows or movies, like Better Call Saul or Breaking Bad or all the other big prestige good shows. It's this sort of sense that the characters have to act that way. Like, when a circumstance comes up, you just get your sinking feeling in your gut, but that character's going to do that even though he probably shouldn't.
Yeah, you know who they are, and you know the people, and you know the reasons why they behave, and it's sort of, it's explained to you, and it's...
Yeah, exactly. They take the time to sort of demonstrate it, and there's very little of characters sort of entering the show and going, the thing about me is, yeah, I tell it like it is, or I'm a bit of a chancer, or some shit.
Yeah, exactly. You don't get, none of that. Even a character like Mike, who is really he's introvert, withdrawn, doesn't talk very much about himself, doesn't really give much away, but you do, as time goes by, you get into the character more, and I'm glad the fact they've given the actor who plays him a bit more emotional range this time. He acts in different ways, and you find out more about his life, and it's absolutely fascinating.
It was that one episode of Series 1, wasn't there, the big Mike flashback, where you had
fills in his entire backstory.
A full-on emotional breakdown at the end.
Yeah, and he acted really well.
That was really good. That was really powerful. As I felt like Series 1, plot-wise, was a bit loose. I came out with a strong sense of the feelings, but when I realised that Season 2 was about to start, I did have to go and read Wikipedia to remember what the hell happened in Season 1, to be honest. The actual plot, more so than it does in other shows, had drifted from me a bit.
Yeah, the plot is important, but the main draw of this show is the characters. It's, when obviously Breaking Bad is a very plot-focused show. Game of Thrones is very plot-focused. I think this is more in the sort of vein of shows that are popular now that are more character-focused, like Orange is the New Black. Mad Men was very much like that.
Well, both this show and Breaking Bad, I mean, I guess the thing that ties them together, even though they're different, is this sort of middle-aged men acting out their self-destruction thing. This sort of people on this track towards inevitable badness, which I guess you're reminded of with these sort of constant flash-forwards to black and white, slightly older, in-hiding Saul that they seem to be doing once per season.
Yeah, the first bit of each season has flash-forward to post-Breaking Bad Saul. I think it'd be interesting to see what will happen with Better Call Saul if they make get up to 5 series like Breaking Bad. I think at some point they will either skip over or do a series that fits around the plot of Breaking Bad but is different. And then we'll get a series of what's actually doing after Breaking Bad. And I'd be interested to see where they take the character after all the events of Breaking Bad.
If I had to guess, I mean, based partly on how they wrapped up Breaking Bad in a similar way, I'd guess that the second to last or third to last episode of Better Call Saul will probably end with him joining up with Walter and Jesse, and then you'll get 1 or 2 episodes on what post-Breaking Bad Saul did next, and then the show will end. I don't think there's much to be gained from retelling Breaking Bad from a different angle for more than 1 episode or something. I think that way lies agony.
I don't think there's a really way you can make that interesting. Although they are very good writers, and I'm consistently by surprise by how good and how well written Better Call Saul is. There's a self-contained story here that's not to do with the story they've already told. which is not what a lot of other prequels are like.
Well, yeah, but yeah, that's what I meant earlier. Yeah, the idea that because you've got this setup that you're attached to with his current job and his current love interest and his brother and stuff, and who are just not in Breaking Bad at all, there is still, what happens to them tension. But the only characters are going to survive are... But I guess Mike doesn't seem to have changed that much. The only thing that has to happen between him and the start of Breaking Bad is that he stops working at a car park and hooks up with Gus Fring. But... Yeah. Saul, it's pretty much all to play for with him.
Gus is a character I'd be interested in seeing more of. If they managed to bring him into Better Call Saul in an interesting way, I think that would be a good character who could cross over.
He better come back to Once Upon a Time earlier this year, so if he could do that, I really hope he can do Better Call Saul.
Yeah, I'm sure he can fit both characters into his schedule. But I think that's one character, and obviously Tuco's appeared before, he might appear again. But I like this new drug dealer. I don't want to say villain, because it's not a show of heroes and villains, but this new drug dealer character they've introduced.
What, Nacho?
Nacho, yeah, in the last series. Played by the guy who was in Orphan Black and who's the villain in Far Cry 3.
Is he Pitiful Vic, the ex-boyfriend from Orphan Black?
Yeah, the one who gets his hand cut off.
I love that guy.
Yeah, he's amazing in the
obviously I hate that guy, but his suffering brings me great glee.
Yeah, he's it's the same guy. I'm certain it's the same guy. And he was the villain in Far Cry 3, which was excellent performance and excellent game.
As I say, part of me feels like they're going to play with this sort of dual identity, lawyer by day, criminal lawyer by night thing for the rest of the season, but they are capable of surprising me. It's possible that this whole setup will have self-destructed by episode 5 or something, and he'll be back setting up his criminal empire or feeling sorry for himself again by about episode 6. I know they have the capacity to surprise me.
They've wrapped up a lot of the plot from Series 1 in Series 2 already. They've wrapped up most of Mike's story. They've wrapped up the story... Well, they've got Saul together with his love interest. The only sort of major unresolved tension is between Saul and his older brother. But I can imagine they'll be introducing new plot threads or evolving the stories they've got in new ways.
I think bringing him together with the love interest is, part of the escalating... which way will he turn thing? Because if his day job as a lawyer was an endless parade of drudgery and bullshit, then you'd be really unambiguously rooting for him to just piss off and become Saul. But because he has his relationship, which he's clearly quite attached to, and she's a reasonably likeable character, you are at least somewhat conflicted at what you think he should do or what you're rooting for him to do.
Yeah, certainly. There's that sense that they're trying to lead the audience in the direction that they don't want him to become Saul, but at the same time they do want him to become Saul, because Saul's a character we know and love from Breaking Bad. And Bob Odenkirk is absolutely excellent at playing Saul in Breaking Bad, and he's excellent at playing Saul in Better Call Saul. So there's created this kind of dichotomy in the audience's mind, which is some way we want him to become the Saul we know from Breaking Bad, so we can see more of that character. But in another way, we want him to have this life he's slowly making for himself, this happy life as a successful, legal, normal lawyer, with a partner.
Yeah, I don't know how they're going to pace it, but you got to assume we get a season or two of him working as Saul Goodman before the Breaking Bad shit goes down. I'd
be interested to see a whole series of him as Saul Goodman we know from Breaking Bad, but before he meets Walter and Jesse.
But he was quite well established as Saul, as the Better Call Saul guy.
Yeah.
But at the start of that, so there's plenty of scope in the backstory to have him do at least a season, or if not a couple of seasons of that.
I'd like to see him wheel and deal his way through the criminal underworld of Albuquerque. That could be interesting and very entertaining to watch.
I think possibly as he becomes more and more Saul Goodman, that's when you're going to get more and more of the world of Breaking Bad leaking through into the show. You're going to get a bit more in the way of gunfights and maybe Bob Odenkirk racing around in his pants. I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah, that's the way. That's probably when they can bring in Tuco more. Maybe they'll bring in Gus more. They might bring in Hank he could be a character who could cross over. Probably not in a major way, but if he came in the background, I think he'd be a character who could be good to see for an episode again.
It'd be fun. I think they've got a good level of not getting too carried away with the "hey, it's him" factor, because that gets annoying in large amounts. I'm currently watching Gotham, and to be honest, at least once per episode you get a "hey, you remember him? It's him from Batman," and it gets a bit tiring. So yeah, I'm pleased that they're being a bit more restrained.
Yeah, I think any spin-off, prequel, sequel has to survive on its own merits. It can't just be an endless parade of familiar cameos. And they've done that very well. The fact they've only carried Mike over as the only character that's in both. That's allowed it to stand on its own 2 feet. It's got a very different story. Drugs really doesn't feature into it. This is much more about the legal system. And it's a thing in its own right. Sometimes I'm watching and I don't even, Breaking Bad's not in my head at all. This is a story in its own right, and I'm engaging the story. I'm liking these characters, and I want to go on a journey with them.
Sometimes I watch enough Better Call Saul to forget about Breaking Bad. But yeah, I think the Breaking Bad setup is the sort of harbinger of doom over the show in a way. I think if they use the symbolism effectively, then basically the moment Walter/Heisenberg steps over his front door, then that's the oh shit he's fucked moment. That's when you know it's all gone horribly wrong. I think honestly I wouldn't be surprised if the inevitable eventual Bryan Cranston appearance is about 2 seconds long, where he just steps through the front door, Saul goes oh hello, and then you get a massive funereal cut to black, and then you just know he's screwed.
They'll probably even just show the hat or something like that.
I think since they've dangled post Breaking Bad Cinnabon Saul out there, they must have a way of picking up that dangle. They must be doing
something with that.
Yeah, unless they get cancelled. But I haven't actually been reading the ratings, but I can't imagine they're that bad.
No, I mean, it seems like a popular show. It's certainly a very good show. It's one I'd highly recommend, and it's also, I would certainly say to anyone, as I've met people who said this, who said, I don't want to see it because it looks like another horrible spin-off or a horrible prequel. It looks like that Joey show, which I think I watched all of one episode to realise like this is so bad. How can any human being have looked at this and go, yeah, let's put this on TV? I'm definitely happy with all of our names being associated with this product. But
2 seasons of that. It's 40 episodes. That's
maybe 2. Oh my god!
That's more than a lot of good shows ever get.
It's more than Firefly got. So there's really no justice. But yeah, people have spoken to me and said like, oh, it can't be good. It can never be as good as Breaking Bad. It's just another lazy cash in. And I've said to these people, actually watch it because it's a thing in its own right. It's a story in its own right. You don't need to have seen Breaking Bad before, and even if you're entirely cynical about spin-offs, then this one could restore your faith.
Okay, second up this week, it's our first foray into the sphere of comics, which, as I think we mentioned last week, I have loved since the age of 10, and Alastair, I don't think has ever read a single one, have you?
I've read a few graphic novels, but I've not read any kind of, anything that began life as certainly a famous comic, like Spider-Man, X-Men.
None of your mainstream superhero comics, then?
No, I've never read a mainstream superhero comic. I think I read a few Batman graphic novels at university. I read, Nightfall.
As those of you who like comics probably already know, the other week DC announced that they are relaunching for the second time in about 5 years, which might sound quite frequent, but Marvel have relaunched at least once every 18 months. I don't want to get too bogged down in comics history, but back in 2011, DC basically deleted their entire history, or a sizable chunk of it, and started all their comics again from 1. This was the New 52, which, depending on who you ask, was either a good idea that didn't quite work out, or a complete atrocity. Generally, where people stand on the good idea atrocity scale tends to be based on how attached they were to old DC continuity, to be honest.
And this is what they're doing again. Are they resetting the timelines?
No, the timelines are not resetting this time. We know this because although we haven't got massive amounts of in-depth detail, they have released a picture of the words, "It's not a reboot, honest." So they're not resetting the timelines. If anything, what I think they're doing is sort of merging in some way the New 52 last 5 years timeline with the one that existed before that. It appeared to move some of the things back into continuity, because the main thing with the New 52 is a lot of characters disappeared from continuity, and the hardcore fan base who'd followed those characters for a long time were annoyed by this, and a lot of the publicity for DC Rebirth has used things like getting back to our core values, or bringing back the hardcore fans, or appealing to people who have huge amounts of long boxes, and I think their exact comment on whether it'll be accessible to newcomers as well was something like, hopefully they won't be too lost, which is perhaps an unfortunate soundbite, if only because, I don't know, in a world where there genuinely does seem to be a tangible new audience coming into comics courtesy of the movies, getting into characters like Ms. Marvel, and from DC, Batgirl also resonates quite a bit with that audience. I don't know, there's a feeling that pivoting back to hardcore continuity stuff might not really be the way to go.
It doesn't sound like they're going out of their way to make comics more accessible to a non-comics reader. I mean, I approach this very much as someone who's like, my experience of comics is kind of been through all the pop culture they've kind of created aside from their own existence. From, there was the Batman cartoon, which I watched when I was, sort of a kid and stuff. There was the X-Men cartoon. And then obviously when I got into my teens, they had the first wave, and now into the second wave of these big superhero movies, the X-Men, Spider-Man, Marvel, Avengers, sort of Batman franchises. And obviously that's really brought superheroes into the mainstream. I mean, superheroes are always a cultural icon, as much as anything from like Elvis to Marilyn Monroe, but this really brought the story and continuity and the characters of comics into mainstream popular awareness. I mean, we said last week the success of a movie like Deadpool can only be because most cinema goers are aware of the codes and conventions of a superhero film, so they can be poked fun at. But it's strange that DC would not want to capitalise on that. Instead, they'd want to kind of go back to their core audience. I can assume this is only because previous decisions have alienated their core audience and caused an effect to their sales.
It's more, there was another sort of publishing event type thing, which was called DCU, that's the word U, which was actually, a genuine attempt to go after some of this more diverse, less familiar with comics, Ms. Marvel type audience, by giving them slightly quirkier characters with more minorities. There was a comic with a gay lead character, the Midnighter. There was a few more female leads. There was some sort of quirky indie-ish stuff. And based on what we've seen of the sales figures, that just hasn't connected. I think there's some people who are kind of reading Rebirth as, well, we tried to give you what you thought you wanted, but you didn't seem to want it from us, so screw you guys, we're off home.
Yeah, that does make sense. It does make sense. So, as someone who doesn't really read comics but hears about them, like I say, through the pop culture thing, the thing that I find sort of most interesting but also most confusing about comics is these enormous stories that they've had going in some cases. I think Batman began in the 30s, did it?
Yeah, I think there was a period up till probably the late 90s, depending on which character, where comics really were just this massive soap opera stretching back to, as you say, in some cases the 30s, in the case of the Stan Lee Marvel characters, the 60s, whatever.
Yeah, they've got this single consistent story, which, although it may weave all over the place, is basically the story of one character. Or,
which causes all sorts of problems with accessibility and, the vague idea that this is all meant to be one story, but the characters are all still roughly the same age. And,
it's a bit like Doctor Who in that regards.
That comparison was very much coming next. Since about 2000, they've sort of, certainly over the course of the 2000s, and very strongly since the 2010s, it's kind of pivoted into this sort of, I guess, a sort of seasonal model with the idea of the writer as creative controller. So in a similar way, you have the idea of Russell T Davies's Doctor Who, followed by Stephen Moffat's Doctor Who. There was Jonathan Hickman's Avengers run, which just finished, and now a guy called Mark Waid has taken over the Avengers. And rather than it being one long sort of ongoing story between them, basically Jonathan Hickman did a massive explosive story which tied up all his loose ends, and basically reset Avengers to a sort of standard setup, and then buggered off, and now the new writer can do whatever he wants, and eventually he'll build his stories to a climax, put his toys back into a box, and then the next guy will come on. And this is very much the model that's happening at the moment.
So if you were looking to get into comics, a good way to do it would be to wait until a character you're interested in reaches one of these writer changeover points, and then you can pick up it'll be more accessible for you to pick it up. As
a reaction to this, comics have sort of ditched the idea of massive long-running legacy numbering. Like, there was, until about the 2000s, comics had like massive treble-digit numbers. There was Amazing Spider-Man 700. But in order to try and accommodate this and make it seem more accessible, basically, whenever a new writer comes on and they reset the status quo, generally they start the comic series again with a 1.
So it makes it easier to follow.
Generally, the idea being, look everyone, here is your jumping on point, here is your new writer with your new storylines. And DC Rebirth, ultimately, is an attempt to do that on a massive scale, because they're starting all the comics again from 1.
Yeah, I see. Because there are obviously, although comics, the famous comics have these big long-running stories that are very, very famous self-contained stories within these, which somehow fit into these things. So things that people pull out. I mean, there's like Avengers Civil War, obviously a film of that coming this year. Batman Nightfall is a very famous Batman. There's Batman The Long Halloween.
There's the Spider-Man Clone Saga. There's Superman's Death. There's various other things. It's a weird dichotomy, really, because I know a lot of old school fans are sort of get a bit nostalgic for the days of when it was like one massive ongoing soap opera, and to an extent, who's writing it didn't entirely matter, because they were sort of, I don't know, it was kind of stylistically flattened into this sort of broadly consistent tone. Whereas nowadays, to an extent, creators are encouraged to be a bit more, this is my Spider-Man, and I'm going to put my stamp on it to an acceptable corporate level. The tone varies a bit more. Like, there was a writer called J. Michael Straczynski came on, the guy from Babylon 5, in fact.
Yeah, he created Babylon 5, and he wrote Murder, She Wrote.
And, weird. And then he came on to Spider-Man, and he, after the last writers were doing normal sort of Spider-Man fights robots and people with animal powers, J. Michael Straczynski's first major storyline was introducing the idea that he was actually the latest in a long line of animal totems. And the reason why so many of his villains were guys with animal powers were because totems were attracted to him, because not in a sex way, but totems were attracted to him because he was a major totem and they were rival totems.
That would actually do some way to kind of make the longer running story make a bit more sense. Provide some kind of broader context.
But realistically, that's one of these things where you're perhaps over-explaining something we didn't really need an explanation. The reason a lot of Spider-Man's villains have animal powers is because heroes tend to attract similarly themed villains, and
It's about creating a theme, I guess.
A lot of Iron Man's villains are people in armour. A lot of Batman's villains are flamboyantly dressed people with mental health problems. Yeah, it is what it is.
There's an element of, in the past, with a lot of things, this is a story, these are the stories that are available, get into them, whereas now there's a much broader range.
But in terms of range, actually, that's one of the major points being raised regarding comics at the moment and DC Rebirth. There are a lot of comics at the moment. Marvel have recently, as a result of their last company relaunch thing, I think they're up to something ridiculous, like 70 or 80 monthly comics, which is, for one company working in broadly one genre, is beyond
huge.
Weird.
I guess it must be because of the monetary popularity they've been brought around by the enormous success of their films.
Yeah, but a lot of these are selling next to nothing. It's a bit weird. Not helped by the fact that comics have not got any cheaper over the years. The $3.99 in American or £2.50 in British for about 20 pages, which will, even if you read it quite slowly, you'll struggle to make last longer than 20-25 minutes. It's a weird decision. DC Rebirth, to be fair, is actually walking back a bit of this, in that the New 52 relaunch, funnily enough, had 52 comics in it.
Makes sense.
It's numerically, you can't fault them. Whereas this only has 37 comics in it, but I think nearly half of them are going to come out twice a month, so the amount of stuff coming out will probably actually remain broadly consistent. But I think they're kind of taking the opinion that if they put out their popular titles twice a month, then people are more likely to then buy 2 comics than if they brought out one popular title and one spin-off.
That makes sense.
People are more likely to buy 2 issues of Batman, the main series, rather than 1 issue of Batman, the main series, and 1 issue of Batman, this is a spin-off and doesn't matter as much.
Yeah, that brings me to the next point I want to ask, is that one of the sense I got from reading around this issue is that one of the criticisms of DC is it relies too much on a core of extremely popular characters, mainly Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman to a lesser extent. But does DC have a problem of too much Batman?
I'm starting to wonder if we're too mean to Batman on this podcast. I mean, I just got done slagging off Gotham. Anyway.
Well, Batman doesn't get beaten up on too much.
The problem DC sometimes seem to have is they're willing to try experimental stuff. Like the New 52, for all that it gets beaten around a bit now for being too populist, did start off with a good 10 to 15 of its launch titles were a bit more interesting, a bit off the beaten track, slightly less obvious creators. There was a Jonah Hex book, which was a cowboy series. There was a series called Demon Knights, written by Paul Cornell, which was set in the medieval DC universe. There were a few bits that were quite interesting, but as the relaunch rumbled on, they got much worse sales than Batman and Green Lantern, which was enjoying a bit of a good spell at the time, comic sales wise. So slowly it just seemed to inevitably happen that the quirky outsider stuff dropped away, and in order to keep the number at 52, it was replaced with more Batman and more Green Lantern and more Justice League or whatever. And It's just, I don't know, I think the reason Marvel tend to emerge from these conversations a bit better than DC is they try a lot of outsider stuff, and sometimes it doesn't work. But the feeling you get from Marvel is that if they try something weird and it doesn't work, they'll probably replace it with something else weird. If DC tries something weird and it doesn't work, they'll throw their hands up and go, oh, we tried.
Have more Batman. Yeah.
But so that's kind of the feeling that I think has emerged from the company for a while, and that's why I think, well, this isn't helped by the fact that, they tried their appeal to the quirky kids relaunch. It clearly didn't work for them, and now this is, I think some people worry this is basically, again, them throwing their hands up and going, right, fine, more of the popular stuff.
It does come across this way from what I've read. I think Marvel is certainly further ahead in the program of making their more obscure characters sort of better known to the public. I mean, at some point I thought that, after we've got the Captain America, Hulk, Thor, Iron Man, sort of films out there, they're going to start scrobbling around for more obscure characters. I mean, when we have to do triathlon or something like that, we may end up with some quite bad films.
Oh, good reference. I mean, to be fair, DC are doing Suicide Squad, which is probably about Ant-Man level obscure, maybe a bit more.
It has the Joker in it, and obviously the Joker is very popular, partly on the back of Dark Knight Rises. And
that's true. Well, the Joker isn't really in the comic, but yeah.
That seems to be right. Harley Quinn is, though, isn't she? And she's the Joker's love interest.
She has been since the New 52, so that has been a good 5 or 6 years, to be fair.
I always thought Harley Quinn was an interesting character because she began life in the Batman animated TV series, which I watched when I was a kid. Introduced there as a sort of, I guess, female Joker or Joker love interest. And then I guess the character was so popular that they carried her, over into the comic.
That does happen a lot. I mean, Marvel have started a comic about the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. There's an attempt to get the Inhumans a bit more involved because they've been involved in the cinematic stuff.
Coulson's in the Avengers comics now.
Well, he's in the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. comic. He's playing a similar role in the comics that he did in the early cinematic universe films. film. He's the guy who pops up. When you need a General Shield agent, you put Phil Coulson in.
Yeah, and Nick Fury's been redone to match Samuel L. Jackson, I believe.
Yeah, that was amazing. The original Nick Fury was a white guy, so they revealed that he had a long lost child who was also called Nick Fury, and then they brought him in as the new Nick Fury Jr. And then the old one got. I think is he technically dead, or has he just been taken away to some wider cosmic purpose? I forget, but he's not currently around.
In the sense that any superhero character dies. I mean, I know they killed off Johnny Storm at one point. They've killed off Professor X at one point. They've killed off Wolverine several times.
For now, Wolverine's still dead for now.
No, I didn't know Wolverine was still dead.
They've just introduced the new female Wolverine, which is Laura Kinney, the Wolverine clone, who was actually also introduced in another medium. Actually, I think she was in the X-Men Evolution cartoon, but then she was brought into the Marvel Universe, and now she's Wolverine. And apparently it's really good. I watched the video reviews from Rachel and Miles Explain the X-Men, and they really like that series, so I'm looking forward to it popping up on Unlimited. I do get a sense from reading comics commentary that comes from a liberal perspective that people are frustrated that Marvel will go up to a certain level with diversity and bringing in more diverse characters and more diverse creators and introducing a wider range of characters into both the shows and the comics. And they kind of don't have to go much beyond that point. And one of the reasons they don't have to go much beyond that point is because, kind of for the most part, feels like DC aren't trying. They don't really have to. There's a lack of competition that leads to Marvel as going, well, we're clearly your one-stop shop for even mildly diverse superhero comics, so...
Thor was a woman for a while. Captain America was black.
Still a woman. Captain America's still black. There's currently 2 Spider-Men. I don't know. I think people would feel like it would be nice if DC got a bit more involved and did more interesting things, thus energising the whole situation, maybe forcing Marvel to do more interesting stuff. Like recently there was a bit of an outcry when they announced that they'd cast a white guy to play Iron Fist. That character is a bit problematic. He was created in the 70s when this stuff wasn't really thought about much, but he's basically a white guy goes into Asian kung fu culture, turns out to be the best at it, and then goes back to become the avatar of kung fu on Earth.
I can see why people would object to that.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people are hoping they would reimagine the character by casting, like a contemporary second-generation Asian American or something, and have him discover his heritage, and that might be a bit better.
You could tell a really interesting story about that, about a character of one cultural background but is so immersed in a different culture that they've really lost contact with that. And you could do that kind of, again, if you want to get the alien outsider perspective, but also maybe doing it in a way that's a bit more, sensitive to exploitative media that may have come in the past.
Yeah, they haven't done that. They've cast Sir Loras Tyrell from Game of Thrones. So, and obviously I don't know whether it's going to be good or not. The Marvel Netflix shows are generally quite well written, so I'm sure it'll be a basically competent bit of television, but it's probably going to be a bit weird from a racial attitudes perspective.
It's unlikely to be as well received as Jessica Jones.
But yes, anyway, so yeah, that's DC Rebirth, yes. The general sense that think that it might be a bit reductive, but on the other hand, they haven't actually announced any of the plots or any of the creators. So, despite the fact we've now talked for half an hour about what this could mean for the world, ultimately I might have to end on a wait and see, to be honest. There are some rumours of interesting-ish creators, so if they could put out some good comics, I'll be happy enough with that.
I think we should reserve judgment until it's out there. I think this will be something we should revisit in a later podcast, and we can evaluate it at that point.
Yeah, I might revisit it once they've announced some details, or once I've actually read some of the comics even. That would be a big step, wouldn't it? Okay, and in a not entirely unrelated area, we're now going to talk about Deadpool again. The one fact we didn't really talk much about last time has actually turned out to be a bit of a discussion point in the intervening period. Because Deadpool, as well as being a satire and a sort of mock-jokey yet conventional send-up of superhero films, was also an R-rated, or 15-rated if you're British, superhero film with some violence and a fair amount of swearing and, well, to be fair, as we did mention last time, dick jokes. And one of the sentiments people have expressed quite a lot in the time since Deadpool came out, and especially in the time since Deadpool turned out to massively overperform and be, I think, one of the most successful R-rated films of all time, has been, are the studios going to do what they often do, take this the wrong way and include, what the people want, we see, is more R-rated mainstream entertainment films. And the obvious main signifier of this has been the thrilling revelation that there might probably be an R-rated cut of Batman v Superman when it comes out on DVD, which is actually so funny in principle I can barely contain myself.
This is the classic example of an interesting thing being jumped on as some kind of passing bandwagon. I think it's really interesting that an R-rated superhero film has done well. Obviously, almost every superhero film is aimed at this narrow demographic that most films are aimed at, which is a kind of people in their sort of early to mid-teens, kind of the cultural barometer of the cinema. Films, like previous superhero movies have been very successful, Avengers, Dark Knight films. They have, although they've been seen by people of all demographics, lots of students, lots of people in their 20s and 30s, the cultural barometer for cinema seems to be these early and mid-teens, people who are basically old enough to go to bars or do other form of entertainment, but go to the cinema a lot. They also participate online a lot, and it seemed that if you can create a buzz amongst that demographic, you create something, then that they will influence other people. So rather than having to influence everyone to see your film, if you influence that specific demographic into seeing your film, then everyone else will follow. Obviously, if you make a film R-rated and they can't see it, this is viewed as a road to financial ruin. Deadpool, however, has bucked the trend. I think this might be because, as we discussed previously, now that superheroes are established as a sort of a genre or subgenre, now you can play around with them and do some variations on it, such as we've had people do comedy superheroes, and now we're seeing people do sort of more violence, more quote-unquote adult superheroes. The fact that therefore this means that this is now the future and every superhero movie should be like this will lead to a lot of bad R-rated superhero movies, to be honest.
I think it's mostly because it wasn't shit, to be honest. I mean,
that is, yeah.
The fact that Deadpool was actually, a good, fun movie. I think what people might perhaps miss to a larger extent is the actual sense of fun, which Marvel movies often have, and Deadpool had, in a sort of naughty R-rated, ho-ho, he's chopped that man's head in half way, but still, it was...
Yeah,
enjoyable.
The success of Deadpool is because it's fun and funny and interesting, but it's a bit different as well. It's a bit. I mean, as well as being more mature in the sense of it's got much more sex and violence in it. It's also more mature in the sense that it's a bit more knowing. It's a bit more kind of I'm having a play around with this. You're intelligent enough to see this. Whereas there are sort of kind of broader meta jokes about the superhero that may fly over the head of the average 12-year-old.
But as we said last time, it was only actually about 3 of them. The rest of it was a combination of dick jokes and sort of slapstick and actual serious superhero narrative. I think if someone now goes away and makes a film which is entirely smug one-liners and people having their heads chopped off, then I don't know. I don't feel like it'll do quite as well.
No one wants to see Quentin Tarantino's superhero movie.
I looked at a list of other R-rated comics adaptations, and sort of Watchmen did okay.
I really didn't like that film. I thought it was really bad.
Watchmen was an okay adaptation of a really good comic.
It's got one of the worst sex scenes ever to sit through.
Oh, that was hilarious. If the Batman v Superman R-rated cut is half that funny, I'll be happy. But
it was unflinchingly awful.
But yeah, I mean, the weird thing about Watchmen was because they were an adult film with an R rating, they often took it upon themselves to make explicit things that actually weren't explicit in the comic. Like, there's a bit in Watchmen, you may or may not remember, where a bloke has his arm chopped off quite violently and viscerally and on screen.
Yeah.
And that's not in the comic. The comic, because it's actually, good, has a certain amount of restraint. It knows that it's kind of more subtly horrific if we don't see it, and if we do see it, it's just, ugh. So the idea of mature superhero films, I think, if anything, the R rating just kind of leads to a sort of lazy maturity, really. A sort of, well, there you go, we've shown someone having their bits pulled off, said fuck a few times, there we go.
Yeah, exactly. And also, if you've got a film that maybe, like Watchmen, that has some more serious issues, some more, again, adult in terms of, like, grown-up content, that may be like, well, we're going to get an R rating because, we're going to go into more serious stuff, so that's an excuse to swear a lot and have violence, and then in the end you're going to end up with probably a film that's more swearing and violence than adult issues.
Yeah, I mean, the most successful dark superhero films of all time, I would imagine, he says, having not looked it up, are the Christopher Nolan Batman films.
I do know that The Dark Knight, the second one in the franchise, is one of the most successful films of all time.
Yeah, exactly. They are very much, the go-tos for, look, a dark superhero film can work. For the most part, they did work. I think the last one got a bit bloated, but for the most part, they did work.
Yeah.
And they're not R-rated. They don't have explicit violence and swearing in them, whatever.
The problem with this is when people try to copy it as a formula. So, as we said before, R-rated Superman is not something that the world needs, and I'm pretty sure that R-rated Batman v Superman is not something the world needs.
Yeah, the funniest tweet I've seen on the subject, or certainly my favourite tweet I've seen on the subject, was from Ant-Man director Peyton Reed, who is, I think, in the middle of developing the Ant-Man sequel, Ant-Man and the Wasp, and tweeted to say, breaking, Ant-Man and the Wasp is going full NC-17, confirmed.
that is very funny.
That's hilarious. That's obviously that's the winning take. I mean, I guess obviously he's very much in the Marvel camp.
Yeah, that's pretty much it in a nutshell. I guess maybe DC are trying to differentiate themselves by being a bit more grown up and a bit more serious with this new cut of Batman v Superman. Maybe they think that, well, if Marvel might be seen as a bit more because it's funny, more lighthearted, it'll be for younger people. We're gonna bring in older people. I think partly the success of R-rated superhero movies is to do with how what is sort of popular and zeitgeisty culture is expanding to not necessarily, in the last few years, to not be that demographic of young teens and mid-teens. I mean, as Netflix has become more popular, you get the feeling that things that are, popular amongst people in their late 20s, 30s, 40s, as we said, things like Breaking Bad, Game of Thrones, Orange is the New Black, these things that are becoming quite big are now resonating with older audiences, and you don't get the sense that by the time you get into your late 20s, early 30s, you're no longer a consumer that companies are, are interested in if they're selling pop culture. Don't get this view that you can influence things. It's to do with a lot of changes that are happening in society, the fact that younger people have less money, and there's a kind of prolonged state of between adolescence and being settled when people have money and time, so therefore they're spending it on pop culture. So as older people are getting more of a say and more influential in pop culture is changing to reflect their more grown-up views and values. Whether this will continue or whether this will just be a flash in the pan, whether it'll be continue, we'll have to wait and see.
I think a lot of the reasons it worked in Deadpool is, ultimately what you want for your thing to work, and by thing I broadly mean almost any pop culture release, to be honest, is you want to get the feeling that you want to give and the impression that people are getting from it are roughly the same. Like, as soon as people start to think, he's trying to do that, but it's just ridiculous, you've sort of lost the audience. And Deadpool is a sort of a good example of creator and character and audience sort of being in the same place. Deadpool works because the fact he's being immature and brash is part of the joke.
Yeah.
Or part of the point. The audience is aware that he's immature because he's an immature character literally jumping around while other characters shake their heads slightly at the fact that he's immature.
Yeah.
If you put a Deadpool level of violence and smugness in a film that didn't seem to be aware that it was annoying, then I think it would be awful.
Yeah, you just end up with probably quite an empty film. A film that's just a lot of violence and a lot of swearing and a lot of dick jokes and probably not much substance to it.
With the risk of something like Batman v Superman, and it gets worse the more you sort of jack up the level of pretension, unfortunately. The higher you go up the pretentiousness scale, the more important it is that the audience are with you. Because if you're doing something which is clearly staggeringly pretentious, and the audience are just completely and utterly, this is silly, then you're fucked.
It depends on how much people like the character. I can understand why maybe people would talk. I can see why people would say, well, Batman is quite a dark character, so therefore a slightly more violent take on Batman. I could see how that could work. Obviously, Deadpool not as well known, but he's very much beloved amongst comic fans. He's a character people really like. I could just imagine it's become problematic if we're going to end up a sense when we're going to get dark and gritty Aquaman, R-rated, starring Khal Drogo from Game of Thrones.
What I'm curious about is whether actual Marvel who are actually successful are going to go near this, or whether they're just going to leave that in the Netflix shows and just watch everyone else do it in the films, or whether we're going to see R-rated Marvels. Because I imagine they're just sort of going to go, well, we've got our sort of dead mainstream fun for the family approach, seems to be working. We'll do the adult stuff in the Netflix shows and you guys can do this in the films.
Well, Marvel are very much mid-cycle. I mean, I can't imagine what the point would be in making, say, Thor Ragnarok R-rated for basically no reason other than the fact that Deadpool was successful. Maybe the next Wolverine movie being R-rated, that could be...
Yeah, I know that's rumoured.
That could be good.
I mean, again, that's a sort of a mix of intense character and content that can work. I could see a mature Wolverine film work, if only because it's always faintly ridiculous. I remember he was in the old cartoon, and he was running around with his claws, and the only thing he was allowed to do with them is cut holes in the walls.
Yeah, or cut people's ropes and tighten it up.
Yeah, or the only time he was allowed to cuss anyone was if it had been very, very narratively established that they were a robot.
Or healed a lot.
Even that wasn't allowed because this was a cartoon and that might bleed. Whereas robots, he can shred the crap out of them. That's it. It was just robots and bits of wall. That's the only thing Wolverine could stab.
Like a R-rated Gambit movie could be good. I know we've got a Gambit movie coming in the near future. I
was kind of hoping that would be like an Ant-Man style heist, but fair enough.
If
you want an intense Gambit sex scene, then good luck to you.
I think some of the things is there's clearly been superhero films in the past that would have benefited from having an R rating to be better films. I mean, we've had a text in from Kirsty on this subject, and she's pointed out that if they made Hancock now, it would have been R rated and been better. I believe the plan originally was that Hancock would be an R-rated movie, and the studio, for whatever reason, said R-rated superhero films don't sell. You need to cut this into a PG-13 film, which, at the net result, I think, of basically cutting the good stuff. I mean, Hancock was a superhero comedy film. Will Smith is a powerful but destructive superhero, and I think best they cut some of the good jokes.
By the time that came out, I'd kind of got the this is garbage alerts from the internet, to be honest, and I just didn't bother seeing it. Will Smith is in Suicide Squad, which isn't R-rated as far as I know, but you never know.
That could have been a film that could benefit from an R rating.
Well, Suicide Squad, if they're going to make grim DC films, Suicide Squad is a grim property.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see where this goes. I don't see this becoming the dominant form of superhero films unless studios completely have a brain meltdown and decide they're going to remake everything and it's going to be R-rated for now on. And then
I'm sort of expecting to see a couple of people give it a go, but yeah, unless another one actually properly succeeds, and unless the Marvel general audience Fun for All the Family film stops succeeding at the same time, I imagine it'll sort of just be a weird thing they tried for a year or so.
Yeah, it was an interesting new facet to the side of superheroes, and it will help to prolong superheroes as a cultural movement because it will allow them to be more varied. The one thing that's going to cause people to fall out of love with superheroes is when the films become so generic that no one's interested anymore, and being able to have a slightly different take, a slightly older, more violent take on it will keep people interested.
Well, it's a similar movement to the one that comics made, Once you've done superheroes for years and years, you can start going, right, well, now that people are familiar with these tropes, we can go, right, what's next? Superheroes with meta-violence, superheroes being investigated by detectives, superheroes as cowboys. But yeah, the idea that superheroes in different roles and positions as a way of freshening up and making it seem more interesting, based on comics, that's pretty much inevitable, and I imagine that may be what's beginning to maybe happen. I mean, we've already had, like, Jessica Jones, which is barely a superhero show, to be honest. It just has superpowers in it.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about this is the fact that since I turned 18, I basically stopped paying any attention to film certificates. I do remember when I was very, very into films, when I was like sort of 16, 17, I knew pretty much off the top of my head the certificates of all of the films that were coming out because I had to know which films it was okay for me to say I was 15 when I was going into and which ones I had to lie to claim I was 18 when I was going through. As soon as I turned 18, I stopped paying attention to this in any way, shape or form because you could just go to see anything you want. It's interesting that it's become something to look into.
It's become something to look into just because, the general track has changed. I mean, for the last few years, it's basically just been inevitable that every mainstream film with moderate fantasy violence in it is going to be 12A, just because the students actively cut to get that. If they submit and it goes over 12A, or I think PG-13 in the States, they then get it back, probably hack the violent bits out and resubmit to get the 12A.
Yeah, exactly.
Because, as you said earlier, losing the 12A loses them a large chunk of the main core important demographic, and then they feel bad about themselves.
So, last week I recommended Nick the BBC detective show Messiah. What did you think of it, Nick?
Well, it wasn't as religious as you promised me, but no, it was good. It was good fun. It was very slow and dry, and yeah, it was compared to modern sort of maverick crime stuff. It was weirdly procedural and subdued. It was sort of somewhere in the middle between Hannibal and Luther.
Yeah,
I quite enjoyed the sort of rigidness of it. Like everything happened sort of in order for reasonably good evidence-based reasons. There weren't really that many moments where the policeman just went, "Hey, I've solved it," using my genius deduction, or because I've detected a slight waver in your voice or something. It was very procedural. Because they had like 3 hours of running time, they were able to do quite a lot of atmospheric shots and elaborate setups of murders. And yeah, it was really good. I felt the tension. I don't know if I'd rate it quite as highly as I know you do, but it was a really good crime show.
It is good, yeah. I think the violence especially is really quite stunning. The murders are really quite, disturbing almost. Like the first one with the guy who's like buried with a tiny straw so he can breathe and then sort of slowly suffocates. And the later ones are, the guy electrocuted over the train is they're pretty nasty.
They do a good job of making that stuff visceral, of really showing it in quick cuts and sort of little flashes of what's happening to make you really feel, oh, shit. And pretty much all the individual slow bits were quite tense. I quite liked the bit in the Opera House where he thinks it's someone and it's actually someone else, and then the guy kills himself. And Messiah 2, for anyone who hasn't seen it, is a crime series from I think the early to mid 2000s. Yeah. So I think the one I saw was in which Ken Stott plays a detective who seems to have a certain interest in serial killers, but not in a Will Graham in Hannibal-esque I can see into their minds way. And a killer starts killing people who have connections to old police cases, and he has to slowly unravel it as these murders get increasingly weird and elaborate, all shot in nice atmospheric ways. And there's a cast of backup policemen who actually get a surprising amount to do, considering it's one of those cop shows. Yeah,
it's got quite a varied cast. A lot of people you'll see from a lot of other BBC detective shows and a lot of American shows. His wife's Death, the character in the show, the actress who plays her is American. She's in Battlestar Galactica and True Blood.
Michelle Forbes, yeah.
Yeah, it's stunningly atmospheric. It's very violent. Unlike crime shows like Luther or Cracker, Messiah keeps the identity of the murderer secret until pretty much the last minute. In all the series, it's very well done how you don't know who the murderer is. Did you guess the murderer before the end?
I didn't know. I'm sure we're going to aim not to spoil who the murderer is in this conversation. I got a vague sense of who was going to end up being important because of the amount of screen time they had, but I didn't entirely guess what was going to happen. No, they threw in enough red herrings and enough sort of subtle diversions, but I didn't... Yeah, I think I got it when they wanted me to. I think I got it when you started to get the creeping sense of, oh shit, this isn't right, in like the last 5 minutes.
Yeah, and I think the note you're trying to hit with a detective show is that when you reveal who the murderer is, you want it to be a character who everyone knows, so they can be surprised, but not it be so obvious. You want to avoid a situation where there's a character who serves no purpose other than to be ultimately the murderer. So, and I think Messiah is always very good at weaving the characters together, giving everyone a role, so that when it's revealed who the murderer is, you are generally surprised.
They even had one character who was sort of this creepy hanger-on at sort of the edge of the cast, who I do remember noticing, I think, towards the end of the first episode, and thinking, wow, you do look like one of those characters who's just there to be the murderer. If it turns out to be you, I'm going to be kind of disappointed.
Yeah, there are several characters.
It didn't, by the way.
Yeah, there's several characters in the show who, re-watching it, I was like, aware of who the murderer is. I was thinking there's so many characters, they really try and make you believe it's that person's the murderer. And you're always wrong. Yeah, I do like the way how the show manipulates you in different directions. I like how the MO evolves. In a lot of serial killer detective shows, they discover quite early on what the pattern is. The murders then continue to follow that pattern. In Messiah, the pattern is usually, as the police discover more information, they discover what the pattern is. It kind of it evolves as the story evolves, which is a bit more complex.
There were parts in it where to be honest, my only real lingering criticism of it was, well, the tone's quite grounded. They seem to have made an effort to make it feel like a real police investigation.
Yeah.
And yet, I don't know, looking back, knowing roughly the ending, there's this part of me that sort of, would the serial killer need to have magic powers to have actually done all that? I mean, even with the level, I know they gave them a certain amount of access to information, but...
To be in all the different places at the different times.
To be in all different places at all different times, do all different things they did. That would require, if not omnipotence, then certainly omniscience.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of it's about atmosphere and stuff, and it didn't bother me that much at the time.
Yeah, that wasn't the way the murderer gets away with kind of so much, but obviously the plot must continue. I think
that's a bit of a genre convention, to be honest. Ultimately you want your massive, elaborate, staged murders pulled off at the last minute, and therefore you just have to accept that the serial killer found a way to escape.
Yeah, I like the. There's another good thing. There's a character with Down syndrome played by an actress who has, I believe, Down syndrome as well. So that was a nice bit of diversity.
I think in representation terms, yeah, there was a gay couple, there was a deaf woman, everyone was pretty Snow White, but aside from that, it was not bad for a show that's already like 10 years old.
The thing that's dated the most in the show is the mobile phones. I do remember as soon as like, oh my god, that's what mobile phones looked like back in 2004.
I think because my sense of time and reality has warped so completely, because it was obviously something from about 10 years ago, my first thought when I saw someone had like a phone and was doing texting was, my god, I didn't realise they had phones in this era. It's like, oh no, hang on, I'm old. They've had phones for like 15 years or something. If not 16 or 17. Bloody hell.
It also has the sort of the same as Luther, the moody skyline shots of East London, although it looks more prosperous in Luther than it did in the early 2000s, when I think Shoreditch was still quite an unpleasant part of London rather than the kind of hipster mecca that it is now.
Yeah. I mean, compared to things like Luther and Sherlock, I think the main difference is that it isn't... I don't know, you don't get the feeling quite as much that it's really about the intensity of the lead actor,
No, you don't get that. And I don't think they don't go into the characters in that much detail. Like, Luther and Sherlock are all about the characters. In fact, I sometimes feel that Sherlock could benefit from being more about the murder mystery and less about Sherlock.
In the last season or so, yes, it could. I guess that's why you told me to just watch 2 without watching 1, because, yeah, there wasn't much continuity. I didn't really need to know much. It took me maybe a bit longer than it might have done to work out that the deaf woman was his wife. But aside from that...
There's very little overlap in plot between Series 1 and Series 2. I mean, his brother is in Series 1 more. When I watched it again, I was like, you don't have to have really known about the story about him and his brother in the first series. You just need to know that's his brother.
I did briefly wonder if they were a couple, but there was helpfully some expository dialogue shortly later to reveal that it was his brother.
Yeah, they're pretty much all self-contained. They did 4 excellent series. The first series is interesting and worth a watch. The third series was all right. The fourth series, Messiah 4, The Harrowing, is really, really good. Basically, they do 7, but rather than doing the 7 layers of purgatory, which the Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt film 7 does, they do the layers of the Inferno. And that is really, really good. That's one's... the first one and the fourth one are quite religious. That's the way the word Messiah comes from.
Yeah, well, yeah, the fact that it was called Messiah 2 Vengeance is Mine, and indeed the fact that you promised me anger and religion. I was a bit sort of, well, I kept expecting the religious angle to come in and never did.
Well, there's something biblical about, sort of revenge on that scale, kind of with that level of intensity and violence.
I guess so. I guess that's more subtle than just having the lead character's name be Bob Messiah or something.
Yeah. The MO in the first series is that the serial killer is killing the apostles. It's quite clever. He has to kill someone with the same name as each of the apostles on their saint day, and the person has to have the same profession as the apostle that was killed.
It just makes it sound like some sort of serial killer scavenger hunt, your challenge for today.
Yeah, it's quite interesting how as it ramps up and they try more and more to protect. There's one episode when they have to protect every single fishmonger in London because on St Andrew's Day, because he was the patron saint of fishmongers. That's why I think the second series is better, because it's not quite as grandiose. The fourth series also when they do the Inferno is really, really good. That would also the Inferno being obviously an incredibly violent book is that leads to that being quite a violent series, and that was really good. It's worth watching. They then did a fifth series which didn't have Ken Scott in it and had Mark Warren, and it wasn't very good, and no one talks about that.
Okay, I might give the rest of the series a go someday. It certainly seems like, really good, solid crime fiction. Maybe a bit enjoyably less flamboyant than the sort of solo detective solves a serial killer stuff you get nowadays.
I think Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss could benefit from watching a couple of series of Messiah to be reminded that a detective show should be about solving a murder or solving a crime, and not so much as a kind of analysis of who is Sherlock Holmes, who is Dr. Watson.
I guess the inevitable thing is it ends up being about the detective to an extent, because you get these big showy actors and it seems a shame not to have them get to do sort of wrenching stuff. So it always ends up being about Benedict Cumberbatch, his sort of intense cheekbones, or Idris Elba and his emotive shouting.
Yeah, I think Luther is the natural successor to Messiah, and I think Luther is a brilliant show. Probably, it's probably my favourite TV show the BBC make. I think Luther gets it right in that you've got enough of the character of Luther. Questions: who is Luther? What does he stand for? And each series, you have a murder to solve. Luther takes the approach of showing you who the murderer is, but you have to you watch Luther as he closes in on it. And I think that show is really, really good in the sense it has an engaging crime story. It has that thriller, race against time, lives are in the balance element, and it has detailed characterization of Luther. And it has Idris Elba in it, who's just a brilliant actor.
As a precursor to Luther, yeah, it's a good show.
I kind of rewatch it every sort of 7 to 8 years, and every time I'm like, there's a reason why I love this show. It is just great. It's really entertaining. It hooks you in from the beginning, keeps you guessing, keeps you on the edge. Every time I rewatch it, there's some aspects of it that I've forgotten or I hadn't noticed before. It certainly stands up to repeated rewatches. For next week, I'm going to be looking at something Nick's recommended to me. So what have you got for me?
Well, as people who've heard this episode, or last episode, or met me, may be able to guess, this is a comic. I did think about throwing you straight into superhero comics, but I don't know, it seemed a shame. Plus, I felt like there were things I could recommend you would be a bit more in your personal wheelhouse, so you could sort of work into superhero comics.
Sounds good.
Yeah, for our first recommendation for you, I'm going to recommend the first volume of The Manhattan Project by Jonathan Hickman and Nick Patara. That
sounds excellent. Yeah, I mean, that sounds like my sort of thing. The bomb that came out of the Manhattan Project is something that's always fascinated and interested me. So yeah, this does look really interesting.
Einstein's in there, and there's also
Oppenheimer.
Yeah, he's a major character. Yeah. So yeah, it's a good comic. It sort of skirts around serious science fiction and also goes a bit into sort of crazy imagery and weird science. It's a very interesting thing. It's very deliberate and elaborate. I'm curious to see what you make of it. I'm looking forward to rereading it myself in preparation as well.
I'm very much looking forward to read this as well. One area of pop culture that I'm kind of criminally underinformed in is comics and graphic novels, so this is a good opportunity to address that.
Yep. So yeah, I will both read through that, and then in 2 glorious weeks' time we will see what you made of it. If not your first comic experience, but your first comics experience in a while. Okay, and that was our second episode. I hope you enjoyed it at least as much as the first. As ever, follow us on Twitter as @MFV Podcast, where you can read our thrilling observations about the making of the show and see our deleted scene excessive fantasy violence broadcasts. You can also follow us on SoundCloud, I gather, technically. Again, soundcloud.com/moderate-fantasy-violence. I'm on Twitter as @NickMB, and you can also see more about my personal writing and stuff at nickbryan.com.
I'm on Twitter at Alastair JR Ball. You can also see more of my writing at nimberspace.co.uk. .co.uk. And if you liked and enjoyed the show, please leave us a review on iTunes. It'll help us to rise up the rankings and get more people listening.
But yeah, we're back in 2 weeks with the Manhattan Project and whatever's come out in the meantime. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
And we're back, live from lovely London. It's Moderate Fantasy Violence. Nick's not there, so you can't hear that. You might hear it later when he listens back to my side.
Probably, yeah.
Oh, you are here.